American Indians. The poster child for the diabetes story is supposed to be the American Indian. Supposedly, according to the American Diabetes Association, people today are just eating too much food and not getting enough exercise to burn off all the calories. This causes obesity, which it is believed is the real cause of most diabetes. Indians, so the story goes, are genetically predisposed to diabetes, and this predisposition has been triggered by the sedentary lifestyle imposed on them when they were confined to reservations, as well as by an unhealthy diet containing large amounts of white flour, fat, and sugar that have replaced traditional foods. And indeed, today, Indians on most reservations in the United States and Canada have rates of diabetes that are the highest in the world. Yet this does not explain why, since all Indian reservations were created by the end of the 19th century and Indian fry bread consisting of white flour deep-fried in lard and eaten with sugar became a staple food on most reservations at that time, diabetes nevertheless did not exist among Indians until the latter half of the 20th century. Before 1940, the Indian Health Service had never listed diabetes as a cause of death for a single Indian. And as late as 1987, surveys done by the Indian Health Service in the United States and the Department of National Health and Welfare in Canada revealed differences in diabetes rates between different populations of Indians that were extreme. 7 cases of diabetes per 1,000 population in the Northwest Territories, 9 in the Yukon, 17 in Alaska, 28 among the Cree Ojibwa of Ontario and Manitoba, 40 on the Lummi Reservation. In Washington, 53 among the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia and the Makah of Washington, 70 on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, 85 on the Crow Reservation in Montana, 125 on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in the Dakotas, 148 on the Chippewa Reservation in Minnesota and North Dakota, 218 on the Winnebago-Omaha Reservation in Nebraska, and 380 on the Gila River Reservation in Arizona. In 1987, neither diet nor lifestyle in these various communities was different enough to account for a 50-fold difference in diabetes rates. But one environmental factor could account for the disparities. Electrification came to most Indian reservations later than it came to most American farms. Even in the late 20th century, some reservations were still not electrified. This included most Indian reserves in the Canadian territories and most native villages in Alaska. When the first electric service came to the Standing Rock Reservation in the Dakotas in the 1950s, diabetes came to that reservation at the same time. The Gila River Reservation is located on the outskirts of Phoenix. Not only is it traversed by high-voltage power lines serving a metropolis of 4 million, but the Gila River Indian community operates its own electric utility and its own telecommunications company. The Pima and Maricopa on the small reservation are exposed to a greater concentration of electromagnetic fields than any other Indian tribes in North America. Brazil. Brazil, which has grown sugar cane since 1516, has been the largest producer and consumer of that commodity since the 17th century. Yet in the 1870s, when diabetes was beginning to be noticed as a disease of civilization in the United States, that disease was completely unknown in the sugar capital of the world, Rio de Janeiro. Brazil today produces over 30 million metric tons of sugar per year and consumes over 130 pounds of white sugar per person, more than the United States. Analysis of the diets of the two countries, Brazil in 2002 and 2003, and the United States from 1996 to 2006, revealed that the average Brazilian obtained 16.7% of his or her calories from table sugar or sugar added to processed foods, while Americans consumed only 15.7% of their calories from refined sugars. Yet the United States had more than 2.5 times the rate of diabetes as Brazil. Bhutan. Sandwiched between the mountainous borders of India and China, the isolated Himalayan kingdom of Bhutan may be the last country in the world to be electrified. Until the 1960s, Bhutan had no banking system, no national currency, and no roads. In the late 1980s, I learned something about this Buddhist country through by some to be the model for James Hilton's Shangri-La when I made the acquaintance of a Canadian woman who worked for CUSO International, the Canadian version of the United States Peace Corps. She had just returned from a 4-year stint in a small Bhutanese village where she taught English to the local children. Bhutan is somewhat larger in area than the Netherlands and has a population just over 750,000. The road system at that time was still extremely limited, and most travel outside the immediate vicinity of the small capital, Thimphu, including travel to my friend's village, was by foot or horseback. She felt privileged to be able to live in that country at all, because outside visitors to Bhutan were limited to 1,000 per year. The woven baskets and other handcrafts that she brought back were intricate and beautiful. Technology was unknown, as there was no electricity at all in most of the country. Diabetes was extremely rare and completely unknown outside the capital. As recently as 2002, Fuelwood provided virtually 100% of all non-commercial energy consumption. Fuelwood consumption at 1.22 tons per capita was one of the highest, if not the highest, in the world. Bhutan was an ideal laboratory in which to monitor the effects of electricity, because that country was about to be transformed from near 0% electrification to 100% electrification in a little over a decade. In 1998, King Jigme Singye Wangchuck ceded some of his powers to a democratic assembly which wanted to modernize the country. The Department of Energy and the Bhutan Electricity Authority were created on July 1, 2002. That same day, the Bhutan Power Corporation was launched. With 1,193 employees, it immediately became the largest corporation in the kingdom. Its mandate was to generate and distribute electricity throughout the kingdom, with a target of full electrification of the country within 10 years. By 2012, the proportion of rural households actually reached by electricity was about 84%. In 2004, 634 new cases of diabetes were reported in Bhutan. The next year, 944. The year after that, 1,470. The following year, 1,732. The next year, 2,541, with 15 deaths. In 2010, there were 91 deaths, and diabetes mellitus was already the 8th most common cause of mortality in the kingdom. Coronary heart disease was number one. Only 66.5% of the population had normal blood sugar. The sudden change in the health of the population, especially the rural population, was being blamed incredibly on the traditional Bhutanese diet, which, however, had not changed. Bhutanese have a penchant for fat-rich foods, reported Tijme Wangchuk in the Bhutan Observer. All Bhutanese delicacies are fat-rich. Salty and fatty foods cause hypertension. Today, one of the main causes of ill health in Bhutan is hypertension caused by oil-rich and salty traditional Bhutanese diet. Rice, the article continued, which is the staple food of the Bhutanese, which is rich in carbohydrates, which turns into fat unless there is physical activity. Perhaps the Bhutanese are not getting enough exercise. 2/3 of the population, the author complained, are not eating enough fruits and vegetables. But the Bhutanese diet has not altered. The Bhutanese people are poor. Their country is mountainous with few roads. They have not all gone out and suddenly bought automobiles, refrigerators, washing machines, televisions, and computers and become a lazy, inactive people. Yet rates of diabetes quadruple in 4 years. Bhutan now ranks 18th in the world in its mortality rate from heart disease. Only one other thing has changed so dramatically in Bhutan in the last decade: electrification and the resulting exposure of the population to electromagnetic fields. We recall from the last chapter that exposure to electromagnetic fields interferes with basic metabolism. The power plants of our cells, the mitochondria, become less active, slowing the rate at which our cells can burn glucose, fats, and protein. Instead of being taken up by our cells, excess fats accumulate in our blood and are deposited on the walls of our arteries, along with the cholesterol that transports them, forming plaques and causing coronary heart disease. This can be prevented by eating a low-fat diet. In the same way, excess glucose, instead of being taken up by our cells, also backs up and accumulates in our blood. This increases the secretion of insulin by our pancreas. Normally, insulin lowers blood sugar by increasing its uptake by our muscles, but now our muscle cells can't keep up. They burn glucose as fast as they can after a meal, and it's no longer fast enough. Most of the excess goes into our fat cells, is converted to fat, and makes us obese. If your pancreas becomes worn out and stops producing insulin, you have type 1 diabetes. If your pancreas is producing enough or too much insulin, but your muscles are unable to use glucose quickly enough, this is interpreted as insulin resistance and you have type 2 diabetes. Eating a diet free of highly refined, quickly digested foods, especially sugar, can prevent this. In fact, before the discovery of insulin in 1922, some doctors, including Elliot Joslin, successfully treated severe cases of diabetes with a near-starvation diet. They radically restricted their patients' intake of not just sugar but all calories, thus ensuring that glucose entered the bloodstream at a rate no faster than the cells could deal with. After several days, fast normalized the blood glucose, first carbohydrates, then proteins, then fats, were gradually reintroduced into the patient's diet. Sugar was eliminated. This saved many people who would have died within a year or two. But in Joslin's time, the very nature of this disease underwent a mysterious transformation. Insulin resistance, which accounts for the vast majority of diabetes in the world today, did not exist before the late 19th century. Neither did obese diabetic patients. Almost all people with diabetes were insulin deficient and they were universally thin. Since insulin is needed in order for muscles and fat cells to absorb glucose, people with little or no insulin will waste away. They pee away their glucose instead of using it for energy and survive by burning their stores of body fat. In fact, overweight diabetics were at first so unusual that late 19th century doctors couldn't quite believe the change in the disease, and some of them didn't. One of these, John Milner Fothergill, a prominent London physician, wrote a letter to a Philadelphia Medical Times in 1884 in which he stated, "When a corpulent, florid complexioned man, well fed and vigorous, passes sugar in his urine, only a tyro would conjecture that he was the victim of classical diabetes or formidable wasting disease." Dr. Fothergill, as it turned out, was in denial. A corpulent, florid, complexioned man himself, Fothergill died of diabetes 5 years later. Today, the disease has changed entirely. Even children with type 1 insulin deficient diabetes tend to be overweight. They are overweight before they become diabetic because of their cells' reduced ability to metabolize fats. They are overweight after they become diabetic because the insulin that they take for the rest of their lives makes their fat cells take up lots of glucose and store it as fat.